Chapter 3. Early Presents. When Jimmy was able to speak, his voice came out shaky and a little jagged. I've always wanted to meet you. Oh, we've met before, but you were very, very young, Santa replied. You crept downstairs one Christmas Eve and caught me red-handed, so to speak. Santa held up one of his crimson-gloved hands and grinned. Well, red with white trim, anyway. I did? I mean, you were... Santa chuckled. Aside from Jimmy, no one else in the room seemed to notice the ward's newest visitor. I was mid-snack when you surprised me. Your mother makes some of the best hazelnut cookies I have ever tasted since we're on the subject. She does? Oh, yes. It's been far too long since she has baked them, a travesty I intend to remedy. You do? I promise. If you will permit me, that is, Santa said, winking. But where was I? Oh, yes, the first time we met. There I was, enjoying my second cookie, and in you walked. Just rounded the corner and took old Santa by surprise. You have to understand, it's a very rare event when I am caught off guard on Christmas Eve. I dare say it's happened less than a dozen times in 100 years. But there you were, standing in the doorway, eyes wide as snowballs. Santa began to laugh, rocking back and forth as he did. I nearly choked at the sight of you. We had a grand time that evening, you and I. I promised then that we'd speak again one day. So here we are. I wish I could remember that, Jimmy said. Oh, it will come back. Jimmy looked over at his mother and then back out at the ward. No one paid any attention to the two as they spoke. Am I dreaming? Well, I should hope not, Santa replied. If you are, then I'm not really here, and that means I'm either behind schedule or was sidetracked in some way. Behind schedule? Well, Christmas is only a couple days away. There's much to do between now and then, as you know. Jimmy nodded. So, am I the only person who can see you right now? Well, at the moment, yes. We wouldn't want to wake everyone, would we? Jimmy glanced back to his mother. I wish my mom could meet you, though. Little Susie? Oh, we've met. She didn't surprise me like you did, but we're acquainted. Maybe I can tell you that story if we have time. Time? Santa walked over to Jimmy's side and ran his hand over the frosted window pane. The foggy ice crystals on the outside of the glass vanished, and Santa stared out into the storm. I have some friends who would very much like to meet you, Jim, he said. I promised I would bring them along tonight, and I always keep my promises. Friends? Some of the elves, yes. You brought elves? Actually, I'm not sure I could have come without them. They are a persistent lot. And that brings me to the reason for my visit. Santa looked down at Jimmy and smiled. I would very much like to take you back home, Jim. Home to the North Pole, that is. The missus is keen to meet you, as are the rest of the elves. Oh, and the reindeer, especially Dasher. The two of you hit it off quite well. Dasher? We did? Oh, yes. I can come to the North Pole with you, if you like. And don't worry about your mother. We'll be back before she wakes up in the morning. Jimmy shook his head as if to clear it and grinned and began to laugh. I would like to see the North Pole very much, he said, but then stopped and looked away. A shadow of regret washed over his features, and when Jimmy looked up again, several tears glistened in his eyes. But I'm sick, Santa. I mean, I'm really sick. I'm not sure I should go. Santa placed a hand on Jimmy's shoulder and smiled. Don't you worry about that, Jim. Let's just say I have a few tricks up my sleeve for nasty coughs like yours. Helped bake 'em myself, in fact. At that, Santa reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a large red and green cookie. I'll tell you what. You eat that while I go up to the roof and ready the sleigh. If you aren't feeling better by the time I get back, then my name's not Saint Nick." Santa turned and hurried out of the ward. Jimmy sat in his bed stunned, his head bursting with questions. Had he dozed off? Was he dreaming now? Could he wake up if he wanted to? Did he want to? Would he ever want to? He stared down at the cookie Santa had given him and turned it over in his hands. It smelled wonderful. Red and green frosting was swirled around the top, and tiny silver snowflakes dotted its surface. Jimmy took a bite, and before he could swallow, was positive it was the best-tasting cookie he had ever tried. By the time he finished the last bite, he felt better. Better than he had in months. Wonderful, in fact. Jimmy looked over to his mother and contemplated waking her. He wanted her to see Santa, to know that he felt better and not to worry. But he did none of these things. Something in the back of his mind told him to wait, that he would have a chance to tell his mother everything later. Santa returned after a few minutes. His coat and hat were covered in snow, as was his beard. Nurse Amy was back at her station, but she took no notice of Santa. She just flipped through a magazine and hummed along to the Christmas tunes floating about. "Feeling better?" Santa asked. Jimmy nodded. "Better than I felt in a long time." "Grand. So what do you say? Would you like to visit the North Pole with me? Stay for a while, have an adventure or two?" "More than anything." Santa laughed loud at that. "All right, then. I brought you a new coat. It can get a bit cold out there in the storm, but this should do quite nicely." Santa pulled an emerald green coat from a large red bag and handed it to Jimmy. "It looks almost like yours," Jimmy said. "Well, Miss Claus made both of them. She worked on yours for a month straight." "She did?" "Oh, yes. But don't tell her I told you so. She gets embarrassed easily," Santa said and winked. Jimmy climbed out of his bed and pulled on the coat. "You might want these too," Santa said, and handed Jimmy a pair of black boots. "Now those I made. They're lined with reindeer fur. Comet always donates the best fur for boots." "Thank you." Santa laughed. "My pleasure, Jim."